commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, for the benefit of those listening. That wasn't the Honourable Peter Dunn. That was the Honourable Phil Heatley, and it's perhaps interesting that Mr Dunn isn't giving that speech, given some matters that I will come to shortly about what has previously happened with the matter of the student loan repayment holiday. I just wanted to pick up on one matter that the Minister mentioned in his speech about the question of exactly when this bill was going to be enacted. Now, those listening may not be aware that most of the ideas and changes in this bill were actually part of Budget 2011. So there's been quite a length of time for the government to get its act together and decide on the changes, Mr Speaker, that it wanted to make. But the bill's wended its way through the process and finally found its way back here from the Select Committee just last week. There was an attempt made by the government. We quickly did the second reading and the committee stages, but they didn't quite get the third reading through in time, so that we now have two retrospective commencement clauses in this bill. And I think as a matter of principle, it's worth putting on the record that retrospective commencement clauses are perhaps not ideal. I think Mr Williamson would agree with that. Yes, he's nodding. They're not ideal in government. The government actually should have its act together in time to make, suboptimal indeed, to make sure that they actually get a bill ready in time. So what we now have in the commencement clause is a retrospective clause that caused some consternation on this side of the chamber during the committee stages, when it appeared that there was a retrospective clause that was going to allow or remove the ability not to charge interest on loans. It turns out that that's to do with the transfer of arrangements between StudyLink and IRD. It was just a pity during the committee stages that there was no government minister able to actually explain that at the time, which perhaps raises some questions about how much the government members actually knew about the bill. But now, Mr Speaker, as a result of the disorganisation of the national-led government, we have a second retrospective clause in the commencement, and that is that the whole rest of the Act, other than the earlier retrospective clause, is deemed to have come into force on the 1st of April, an appropriate date, some might say. Because the 1st of April is obviously passed, and if you look at the Inland Revenue Department's website, Mr Speaker, you will see that they were expecting it to be in place by the 1st of April. They were telling graduates about what their obligations would be under the clauses of this bill. But the government, in its hopeless organisation of the House, has failed to get this bill passed, and so has to put in a second retrospective clause into this bill, and that does them no credit, Mr Speaker. When we come to the content of the bill itself, issues have been traversed in the debate that the main purpose of this bill, the substantive part of this bill, is to reduce the student loan repayment holiday from 3 years to 1 year. And in 2007, as has been previously quoted in debates, a person named the Honourable Peter Dunn, who was then the Minister for Revenue under the Labor government, talked about the fact that the 3-year repayment holiday represented a pragmatic approach to dealing with what we have commonly come to know as the good old Kiwi OE. So this interest-free student loan scheme was put into place, but it was acknowledged that people would still want to undertake the OE. Most New Zealanders who undertake their OE come home, and they undertake their OE to get that experience and want to come back to New Zealand to contribute. Mr Dunn, as he said in 2007, said that we needed to find a pragmatic way through, and being someone who places great virtue on pragmatism, Mr Dunn told the House, it struck me that the logical course of action was to derive the solution that we have, to extend the holiday period for 3 years, recognising the fact that young New Zealanders take that extended period overseas. A very pragmatic decision. However, Mr Dunn has changed his mind 5 years on and is now proposing to reduce that repayment holiday to 1 year. The Labor Party and indeed the Green Party proposed amendments in order to both keep it at 3 years, but we also proposed an amendment to compromise at 2 years. And the reason we proposed that amendment was because most New Zealanders, by far the majority of New Zealanders who go overseas to have their overseas experience, go to the United Kingdom. And in the United Kingdom, they are, for the most part, eligible for a 2-year visa. So actually this bill runs counter to the reality of what students, our graduates, are doing at the end of their degrees. And it's unfortunate that that pragmatism has been let go. But what's more unfortunate, Mr. Speaker, is that the advice that the Treasury and the Ministry of Education actually gave the government about this is it's not going to even do the things that they'd like it to do. The Treasury told them that there is, quote, little evidence that this proposal will improve repayments. It's likely to increase debt held by overseas borrowers, discourage them from returning, and therefore increase the annual student loans impairment. So the Treasury actually said it's not going to do what you think it's going to do. The Ministry of Education followed that up. They said that this can be expected to have a negative impact at the margin on borrowers' decisions regarding whether to return to New Zealand, and that it will result in an ongoing increase in the student loan debt held by the government of about $12 million each year. So the whole policy is flawed. Now, in the committee stage debate, Mr Dunn went through what he considered to be a logical process for why we shouldn't have the student loan scheme, we shouldn't have the 3-year holiday. And in doing so, he actually created an argument, Mr Speaker, for not having the repayment holiday at all, because he wanted borrowers to be treated exactly the same wherever they live. Well, if borrowers are going to be treated exactly the same wherever they live, then there should be no repayment holiday. And frankly, actually, everybody should be being charged interest, or everybody should not be being charged interest. We shouldn't have either of those situations. It's not realistic, it's not pragmatic, and I think it's really unfortunate, Mr Speaker, that the government has chosen to do this when there is no real positive outcome for them in terms of the policies that they're trying to achieve. So I think ignoring the possibility of leaving the repayment holiday at 3 years, or indeed the compromise that the Labour Party proposed of 2 years, I think it's extremely sad that this government has done that, and it has led to the Labour Party opposing this bill. Now, there are other elements of the bill, Mr Speaker, that are okay. I think that they could be helpful in ensuring that we follow up with borrowers overseas. And on this side of the House, I want to make absolutely clear, whatever concerns at an individual level some of us might have with the student loan scheme, once people enter into those loan contracts, I do believe they should be paying their loans back, and we do need to follow up those people internationally who don't. Some of the changes that have been made in this bill to facilitate that include a much greater role for the contact person who is listed by a borrower for when they go overseas. We asked Mr Dunn during the committee stages debate to ensure that those borrowers who nominate a contact person, that those contact people are now aware of their increased responsibility, because they do have increased responsibilities as a result of the clauses in this bill. But, Mr Speaker, we got some assurance about that from Mr Dunn, but we certainly were looking for a greater assurance that when people, mainly parents, I have to add, become the registered contact person, they're aware of what their responsibilities now are. And I do hope that the IRD and the Minister follow through on that, lest we have some parents getting somewhat surprising letters and phone calls. I mean, one thing, for instance, Mr Speaker, is that when a contact person moves, they now have to let the IRD know that they've moved. I'm not sure many people will be aware of that, and that is now an obligation in law. And so it is actually something that needs to be looked at very closely. So, Mr Speaker, I regret the fact that the Labour Party has to oppose this bill, but we do feel the government has failed to listen to reason around the student repayment holiday. I just would finish by saying that this bill really does very little in terms of the student loan scheme. The amount of money that will actually be coming back now is so small that it's 0.012% of the nominal loan balance. That's the optimistic end, Dr Clark tells me. And so this bill's not actually going to do a lot to reduce student loan debt. And unfortunately, I think where we're heading with the student loan scheme under this government is greater restriction on its use. And we know that in the budget we're going to be seeing more changes around student support. The National Party has a policy that says students should not borrow from the scheme if they're working towards qualifications. It's the other way around. They want to ensure that students who borrow from the scheme are working towards qualifications that can attract an income that allows them to pay back the loan. That sounds to me like this government is planning to restrict access to student loans for certain types of courses. That is part of Stephen Joyce's agenda to, quote, dampen down demand for tertiary education. On this side of the House, we want more people in tertiary education. We want more people getting skills and training. Limiting access to the student loan scheme, limiting access to opportunities is not the path forward, Mr Speaker. This bill, while it tinkers around with the student loan scheme, I fear is merely a forerunner to much more significant changes that will be negative for tertiary education and students in New Zealand.
The Honourable John Banks.
Speaker, I rise to